The only thing you need to understand before learning about punctuation is the difference between independent and dependent clauses. An independent clause can be a sentence all by itself. Dependent clauses can't do that. So my name is Mr. Mayhem is an independent clause, but 30 gallons of gasoline in an unlit match is not. If you understand the difference, you should be fine. This brings us to our first punctuation mark, the period. Periods are most often used to mark the ends of sentences. In order to have a complete sentence, you have to have at least one independent clause. So my name is Mr. Mayhem could be a sentence all by itself. Toss a period on the end of it and you're done. The only other place you might use a period in everyday writing is in abbreviations. I can't think of a single reason that you'd ever want to spell out the word Mr., so we'll just shorten it to MR, throw in another period, and we have a perfectly punctuated sentence. There are two other punctuation marks that can also be used to end sentences, the question mark and the exclamation point. Use question marks at the end of questions and exclamation points at the end of exclamations. In all academic and professional circles, never use more than one of these at a time. But you don't have to end your sentence just because you have an independent clause. There are many ways to combine independent clauses together. The most basic way involves a comma. Here are two independent clauses. She is devious and I like her. Now, a comma isn't strong enough to hold these two independent clauses together all by itself. If you want to use a comma to connect two independent clauses, you need to use a conjunction. There are a few different kinds of conjunctions, but here are the ones you can use this way. These are technically known as coordinating conjunctions, but I'll just call them FANBOYS because that's a handy acronym for remembering them. For, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. If you want to connect these two independent clauses, choose one of those FANBOYS and toss it in there with a comma. She is devious and I like her. And now we have another perfect sentence, this one with two independent clauses in it. Another way to connect independent clauses is by using the word because. Because is a unique word in that it is powerful enough to put two independent clauses together all by itself. If you use because, you don't need any punctuation. So you could say, I like her because she is devious, and you'll be just fine. Now we get into two of the handiest punctuation marks in the English language, the colon and the semicolon. Both of these can be used to combine independent clauses, but they work in slightly different ways. So let's start with the semicolon. Remember I told you that commas can't hold two independent clauses together. Semicolons, on the other hand, can do that. She is devious, I like her is a perfectly fine sentence. The only trick to using a semicolon is making sure you have an independent clause on both sides of the semicolon. Semicolons can't handle dependent clauses. That's where the colon comes in. Just like semicolons, colons can hold two independent clauses together, but colons can also attach an independent clause to a dependent clause. That's why you'll often see colons at the beginning of lists, like this. I have lofty aspirations, breaking out of prison and clearing my name and making a fresh start. Please note that you have to have an independent clause before the colon. I have lofty aspirations could be a sentence all by itself. Some people forget this and try to use a colon incorrectly. My lofty aspirations include breaking out of prison and clearing my name and making a fresh start. But that doesn't work because my lofty aspirations include is not an independent clause. If you're ever in doubt, pretend for a moment that the colon is actually a period, and see if you have a workable sentence before the colon. If you don't, then don't put a colon there. In this second example, you don't need any punctuation in that spot at all. My lofty aspirations include breaking out of prison and clearing my name and making a fresh start is a perfectly fine sentence. Now, I told you that you can use a semicolon or a colon to combine two independent clauses, so how do you decide which one to use? Well, that depends on why you're combining the two independent clauses in the first place. Let's take these two examples. She is devious, I like her, and I like her, she is devious. Both of these sentences need a punctuation mark to hold their independent clauses together, but one of them would be better off with a semicolon and the other would be better off with a colon. Here's a good rule of thumb for telling the difference. Remember the FANBOYS we just talked about? In sentence number 1, we used comma and to connect the two independent clauses. A semicolon is just like comma and. If you have two sentences that you could join together using comma and, you can use a semicolon instead. Now remember what I said about because? It can join two independent clauses together without any punctuation at all, and that's what we did for sentence number 2. Colons often say because. If you can use because to join two independent clauses together, you can use a colon. But because isn't the only thing that colons say. They can also say namely, or such as, or that is. That's why they're so good at introducing lists. Remember this sentence? You could replace the colon in this sentence with namely or such as, so that's a good sign that the colon is being used properly. In this sentence, on the other hand, replacing the colon with any word would just make the sentence confusing. My lofty aspirations include such as breaking out of prison? That doesn't make any sense, so we know the colon shouldn't be there. So if you have two independent clauses that you can connect with comma and, you can always use a semicolon. If you have two sentences that you can connect with because, you can always use a colon. If you're introducing a list, you can use a colon instead of saying namely or such as. And there you have 3 more perfect sentences. Let's move on to apostrophes. Apostrophes are used mainly for two things, contractions and possession. A contraction is when you leave letters out of a word or phrase. For example, she is devious can become she's devious. She is not devious can become she's not devious or she isn't devious. Really, the only tricky part about contractions is making sure that you don't confuse them with other words. Your sounds like your, there sounds like there, and so on. If you're ever confused about whether you want the contraction or not, just ask yourself if the sentence would make any sense if you expanded the contraction out. You're my only hope still makes sense if you say you are my only hope. I am your only hope doesn't make any sense at all if you say I am you our only hope, so you know it isn't a contraction. The other thing apostrophes are used for is showing possession. Jim's alibi means the alibi that belongs to Jim. Apostrophe S shows possession. Pretty straightforward. It only gets confusing when you're working in the plural. Let's say there's a sinister plot and it has been devised by two criminals. The plot belongs to the criminals. When you have a plural possessive, the apostrophe goes after the S. This is the criminal's master plan. If it belongs to just one criminal, you would say this is the criminal's master plan. Two more fine sentences. That's enough about apostrophes in this video. Let's move on to commas. The comma is the most multifunctional punctuation mark in the English language, and it is therefore the most confusing. There isn't enough time in this video to cover everything there is to say about commas, so I'll just tell you the most useful things. We've already talked about one of them, and that was combining independent clauses using the FANBOYS. That's one excellent use for a comma. Commas are also useful in lists. Let's go back to this sentence. The punctuation of this sentence is just fine as it is, but it's got too many words. We can use commas to tighten things up a bit. I have lofty aspirations, breaking out of prison, clearing my name, and making a fresh start. That's much nicer. Some people will argue that you don't need that last comma because you have that and there. This is a big debate and I don't have time to cover it here. That final comma is known as the Oxford comma, and you'll have to formulate your own opinion about it. Another popular use for commas is for introductory clauses. An introductory clause is a dependent clause that comes at the beginning of a sentence. For example, after a long day of planting explosives, I like to relax. I like to relax is an independent clause and the main part of this sentence. After a long day of planting explosives is a dependent clause, and it can't stand alone. That little comma says, hey reader, here's the subject of the sentence, so pay attention. Look for the subject of your independent clause. It's usually the first word. If you have a dependent clause before that, mark it off with a comma. Some people will say that a comma isn't necessary if an introductory clause is really short, as in, yesterday I ran out of bullets, or this morning I woke up in jail. I feel like it's easier to just say, always put a comma after introductory clauses. Because really, who decides when an introductory clause is big enough to warrant a comma? Always put a comma and you'll never be wrong. Perhaps the most confusing comma rule has to do with appositives. A positive is just a fancy grammar term for when you rename something. For example, my assistant Mr. Vengeance lives in California. In this sentence, Mr. Vengeance and my assistant refer to the same person. So Mr. Vengeance is an appositive. It renames the phrase my assistant. That's easy enough. The confusing part is that you don't always have to use a comma when you have an appositive. It depends on whether the appositive is required for the sentence to make sense. Let me use a different example to make this clear. New York's maximum security prison Sing Sing is tricky to break out of. In this sentence, Sing Sing and New York's maximum security prison are referring to the same thing, so Sing Sing is an appositive. What would happen if we left out the appositive? New York's maximum security prison is tricky to break out of. Well, New York has several maximum security prisons, so this sentence doesn't make a great deal of sense unless you know which prison I'm talking about. So Sing Sing is a very important part of this sentence. That means no commas are required. Now take this sentence. Sing Sing, a maximum security prison in New York, is tricky to break out of. Sing Sing and a maximum security prison in New York are still referring to the same thing, but this time a maximum security prison in New York is the appositive. But how many places called Sing Sing can you think of? It's a pretty unique name, so if I just said Sing Sing is tricky to break out of, it wouldn't be too hard to figure out what I'm talking about. So this appositive is optional. That means you must have commas. Think of the commas as plastic explosives that you can use to remove a freeway overpass. If the phrase is required for the sentence, don't put any explosives there, or else someone might detonate them and ruin everything. Now let's go back to my original example. My assistant, Mr. Vengeance, lives in California. The question is, do I have more than one assistant? The answer is yes, I actually have 3 assistants. So if we pull his name out of the sentence, you'll never have any idea which assistant I'm talking about. So I shouldn't put any explosives there. The sentence should just be, my assistant Mr. Vengeance lives in California. No comma required. The last thing I want to tell you about commas is how to use them when you're quoting stuff. Almost every time you quote somebody, you're going to use a comma to connect what was said to who said it. Here are 2 examples. You saved my life, the president said. The president said, I won't send you back to Sing Sing. Notice that in both cases, the punctuation mark at the end of the quote goes inside the quotation marks. Just remember that, and you'll almost always be right.
And there you have it, pretty much everything you need to know about American punctuation in less than 10 minutes. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll try to make some shorter videos about some of the details.